The question was, what final drive ratio are you running on your Honda XR650R? 1448? Can your bike cruise 75 miles per hour pretty well? I'm working on an XR650R, and I want to be able to cruise on the highway as well as do some trails and fire roads. The bike has 1350 tooth sprockets right now, and I'm thinking of 1548, keeping that 13 front sprocket for gnarly trails and just changing it on site. However, I don't want to change the sprocket in the field if avoidable. What is the best ratio for a decent time on the highway and enough power to lug some trails? My channel comments answer was, yes, I'm running the stock 1448 ratio. A bit low gearing for the highway. I run this for a combination dirt and highway to keep a load off the clutch during single track crawls. The rear tire is slightly oversized, which makes the gearing a tad taller, though still not equivalent to a 1548 or other sprocket changes. Frankly, for dual sport riding on asphalt, I'm always hunting for that non-existent sixth gear during upshifts. My 1984 XR350R has 6 speeds, which seems normal. My 1984 XR500R is a 5-speed. For cruising 75 miles per hour, my bike will do it with the 1448 ratio, but that's a waste of fuel and creates unnecessary piston travel. These engines have so much mid-range power that there is no need to ever experience the rev limiter. Your 1350 ratio must be a real tractor for off-pavement, though way too low for the highway. My bike will likely stick with the 1448 final drive sprockets since it does surprisingly well on idle and tip-in single track, even with a hot cam stage 1 camshaft, which does not seem to bother slow speed performance. 1548 might be okay to save sprocket changing, especially if your sights are set on a 75 mile per hour cruise speed. Fire roads and more moderate trails are less engine and clutch load than crawling through dry creek beds. So let's expand on the issue of sprocket ratios and how to pick the right ratio and for what reasons. This is a countershaft sprocket and the rear sprocket on the final drive system of a motorcycle. The countershaft sprocket runs off the countershaft of the transmission. The rear sprocket obviously is attached to the rear wheel. The ratio between these two sprockets is determined by the number of teeth on the countershaft and rear sprocket. The viewer's comment drew attention to the fact that the stock ratio on the XR650R is a 14-tooth countershaft sprocket and a 48-tooth rear sprocket. This gives us a ratio, and the ratio is 14 to 48 in this case. In this particular case, the XR650R original equipment ratio is 14 and 48. So what is that based on? Sprocket ratios are determined first and foremost by the engine. In this case, the XR650R has a single cylinder and develops a particular kind of power. Sometimes the engine performance level dictates the gearing. For example, if the engine doesn't make a lot of horsepower and the bike weighs as much as this one does, the gearing would have to be lower, meaning that the countershaft sprocket would have to have less teeth, or the rear sprocket would have to have more teeth than it does now in order to create a reduction ratio that would enable a smaller horsepower output engine to deliver the necessary power. The transmission gearing plays a large role too, and that would be the ratios within the transmission that are usually designed to work with the engine power output. This transmission on this particular bike has 5 speeds, and the 5th speed is almost a 1-to-1 ratio. It's actually 1.115 to 1 ratio in 5th gear. All of these factors play into the final drive ratio. This engine puts out so much power, and the overall weight of the bike is such that gearing can be adjusted to the road speeds that the engine is producing efficient power. In this case, 1448 was the United States standard ratio, but there were overseas models that were dual sports that actually had 15-tooth front sprockets with a 41-tooth rear sprocket. That was intentionally designed for a dual sport that did primarily highway riding. Honda in this case picked the 14:48 ratio because the US models were enduro or open desert environment motorcycles. A desert enduro bike is not designed to cruise at 75 miles per hour like the viewer's expectation. A bike like that would require something like the 15:41 ratio to be on the highway and cruising at 75 miles per hour. Since cruising at 75 miles per hour is an important objective for his XR650R, 15:41 sprocket ratio for highway use only would make sense. For this bike, which is ridden off-highway, in situations like crawl-paced, dry creek beds, 15:41 gearing would have the engine stalling constantly from lack of power at the bottom end. That tall 15:41 gearing would also put a tremendous load on the clutch at low crawl speed operation. As I shared in my comment response, I stayed with the 14:48 sprocket arrangement because I am concerned about the ability of this bike to do single track crawl pace without putting a load on the clutch. The taller gearing, like 15:41, would put a load on the clutch unit and create a situation where premature wear of the clutch would be likely. So would coolant boil over. This engine has a peak RPM around 8,200 at the rev limiter. To operate this engine in that RPM range would be ridiculous, since the engine produces exceptional bottom end and mid-range power that would make 6,000 or 6,500 RPM a more realistic red line. So what kind of speed can I expect with the 14:48 sprocket arrangement on the highway at higher engine speeds? This bike will easily make 105 miles per hour. The taller gearing like 15:41 might squeeze a few extra miles per hour out of the bike, but is that really important? Not in my case, because this is truly a dual sport that will spend time off pavement. A somewhat reasonable compromise would be a 15-tooth primary sprocket with the 48-tooth rear sprocket. And worth mentioning, if you were changing sprocket ratios in the field, at the side of the road or at camp, changing sprocket ratios also means a change in the length of the chain, or if you're compensating for that change in sprocket ratio, let's say going from a 14:48 to a 15:48, and you're using the chain with the same exact length for both cases, you're going to have to adjust that rear axle to get the wheel further forward or rearward. What does that mean? In the process, you're also altering the wheelbase of the bike and possibly running out of travel at the adjustment for the axle. So if you're considering a sprocket change in the field as an option, make sure that you have the axle shaft positioned so that the wheelbase length and the chain adjustment can be performed without having to carry an extra chain in addition to the extra sprocket. My general rule of thumb, especially for purpose-built bikes like a US model XR650R, which was principally brought to the United States for enduro riding and competition, my goal would be to first follow the factory sprocket ratio, in this case 14:48, which is based on the engine design and the power output and power range of the engine. Worth mentioning too is that the lower the gearing, and I say lower, I mean 14:48 is lower than 15:48, the higher the engine RPM, the more piston travel you're going to have for the engine. What I mean by this is for every revolution of the crankshaft that's translated to a certain degree of rotation of the sprocket, you will have X amount of travel of the piston up and down in the cylinder. If the engine is running at a higher RPM consistently, that's actually more travel, if you will, of the piston and the rings over the cylinder wall in a given mile. That could lead to premature wear. The trade-off there, however, is that by using lower gearing, meaning a smaller sprocket in the front, larger in the rear, we take the load off the engine, and reducing the engine load in some ways actually increases its longevity. Being geared like an enduro motorcycle, the gearing of 14:48 raises my RPM on the highway to speeds that are not optimal. I would not run the bike at 75 miles an hour continuously, and when I'm on highway, a speed of 65 or 70 miles an hour is plenty. In my comments, I indicated that the 1350 sprocket ratio would be tractor power, a 13-tooth sprocket at the front and 50-tooth sprocket at the rear would create a gear reduction that would make the bottom end power on this bike extraordinary. It would be optimal for semi-trials riding or very low-speed rock crawling or creek bed crawling or whatever. In fact, upshifting out of first gear immediately would be likely. That same 13-tooth, 50-tooth arrangement would also make it difficult to run the bike on the highway, because even cruising at 60 miles per hour would raise the engine RPM to the point that the fuel consumption would be excessive, and there would be radically more piston travel. So again, my formula is to first of all recognize what the manufacturer considered for the optimal final drive ratio, and this would take into account what the bike was intended to do, and in this case, since it is a US model, we'll say enduro open desert riding. That would be my baseline. I'd also mention that tire diameter at the back, any changes there also affect the final drive ratio. I have a slightly larger diameter rear tire, slightly oversized, and in the process have effectively altered the gearing slightly. I know I'm not quite to the point of 15 teeth in the front and 48 teeth at the back, but I am somewhere between those 2 points because I've gone to an oversized tire that, if you will, gives it a slight overdriving effect. In this case, I'm happy overall with the 14-tooth, 48-tooth sprocket arrangement, the chain sized for the axle being on center for wheelbase length, a slightly oversized rear tire that I use so that the tire actually has more bite off pavement. My highway cruise speeds are more like 65 miles an hour and not 75 miles an hour, and I'm a happy camper when I'm off pavement in a dry creek bed.